ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains, though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him. The specter raised a cry and shook its chains and wrung its shadowy hands. This is Carolina Haints. Welcome, dear listener, to the Carolina Haints Podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. The Christmas holiday is filled with symbolism and tradition. Over the past century, it's almost seemed to transcend from a religious holiday to one of cheerful yet ambiguous meaning. Christmas, as a holiday, has some pretty strange roots. And I don't just mean a king baby birthed by a virgin. And beyond its roots, it continues to pick up some fascinating traditions. Rituals are an important part of the Christian faith. Whether you're Catholic, Protestant, or Greek Orthodox, Christians have all manner of rituals that go back even generations before the birth of Christ. Stars, trees, angels, candy canes, caroling, cards, ornaments, gifts, holly, lights, mistletoe, stockings, poinsettias, Yule logs, nativity scenes. The list goes on, and I haven't even touched old St. Nick yet. We'll get back to him in a minute. Yes, it's the most wonderful time of the year. But it wasn't always that way. A few hundred years ago, it was almost like Halloween. It was an occasion marked with self-indulgence and excess. The poor would damn near riot and go door to door demanding food and drink. How can this be, you're asking? Well, let's not forget the original pagan holiday of the winter solstice, which was essentially commandeered by the Vatican to celebrate the birth of Christ. The date itself wasn't chosen to be the accurate birthday, but more like the day the church chose to recognize the birth of Christ. Most historians and biblical scholars reckon that Jesus was likely born sometime in the spring. But what is the winter solstice? Well, it's essentially considered to be the shortest day of the year, marking the beginning of the time in which days get longer. For an entire civilization which depended on sunlight for harvest, this was something to be celebrated. The approximate time around December 25th has been celebrated by almost every ancient civilization prior to the Immaculate Conception. It's worth noting that the early church didn't even recognize the birth of Christ for celebration until over a century after his death. The first Christmases were observed during the Jewish Feast of Trumpets, or what we now call Rosh Hashanah. After several years, the church settled on January 6th, what we now know as Epiphany. As centuries passed, Rome became more and more Christianized. By the year 320 AD, Pope Julius I officially named December 25th as the birthday of Christ, taking the same day as the Roman festival of the birth of the invincible Son. It wasn't until a few years later that the church finally had the state on board, with Emperor Constantine the Great proclaiming Christmas as 25th of December. The church had hoped this would help cancel or overrule any long-existing pagan winter celebrations. After England became a Commonwealth in 1649, Puritan Oliver Cromwell put in place a ban on all Christmas festivities, meaning for it to be a somber day of reflection. And it didn't stop in England. The American colonies, particularly in New England, had completely banned any celebrating of Christmas. As a matter of fact, it was illegal in many states to celebrate Christmas, and we're talking decades after the Revolution. In 1828, New York City even created a special police task force to put a stop to Christmas celebrations. Back in England, when commoners demanded the old ways return, despite their new Puritan rulers' staunch objections, they did to the Puritans what the Puritans had done to the monarchy. They rebelled. King Charles II was finally placed on the throne, and with him a return to the merry old days of raucous revelry. Yes, the old days were back. In the new Christmas carols of the time, you could even hear the demands of the drunken poor at the door of the aristocracy.
We won't go until we get some. We won't go until we get some. We won't go until we get some. So bring it right here. Good tidings.
Christmas had once again become a day of so much violence and looting that churches closed their doors and police were simply unable to maintain any sort of order. But between the two continents, things were slowly changing. The poem The Night Before Christmas was written in 1822, depicting St. Nicholas as a benevolent, jolly old elf. It also helped retool the way people looked at the holiday, giving more of a place for the participation of children. In 1834, the ghost story, A Christmas Carol, was written by Charles Dickens and became a massive success. It not only commented heavily on greed and cruelty, but emphasized Christmas as a time for hope and charity. This was a sentiment that people were ready to adopt. But it really wasn't until after the union of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in 1840 that Christmas began to be considered more of a family event, a time for joy and peace. You see, while Christmas was a time for drunken debauchery in England and America, in Germany, a different set of traditions had taken hold. The day was considered holy and was marked by family gatherings, and food, and trees and decoration. And when the German prince joined England's royal family, he brought these traditions with him. It didn't take long for them to catch on with most English folk, who often looked to royalty as an example anyway. Over the next few decades, especially in America, Christmas began to grow in popularity as Santa Claus could be seen in every store, and Christmas trees became a household tradition. Throughout the 19th century, legislators even passed bills making it an official state holiday. Churches began opening their doors for services. It's perhaps ironic that so many Christians now are turned off by the commercialism of the holiday. But really, without Santa Claus, without Ebenezer Scrooge, Christmas wouldn't really exist, not as we know it today. It seems a bit odd in today's standards that A Christmas Carol, perhaps the world's most popular ghost story, made such a significant contribution to the holiday itself. But there's another Christmas tradition we haven't talked about yet. In Victorian England, telling ghost stories around the fireplace was an absolute staple of Christmas. You can still hear the remnants today in some popular songs.
There'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago.
It's hard to tell exactly where this started. Perhaps it was yet another holdover from the pagan rituals of the winter solstice. After all, long winter nights meant less daylight to work with and more time together, huddled around a fire. in the dark. Well, I don't know about you, but I can certainly see how ghost stories might naturally start being told. The telling of Christmas ghost stories is generally considered an English tradition, as it didn't really take here in America. Despite the attempts of American authors like Washington Irving and Henry James who published ghost stories for Christmas, Americans more or less considered the tradition part of the old ways and settled for a kinder, gentler feeling of the season. Now, I know what you're thinking. Thanks for the history lesson, Dan, but what's this got to do with the Carolinas? Slow your roll. I'm getting to it. But first, we need to stop and recognize another major influential change, and that was the shift from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, which we use today. You see, under the Julian calendar, Old Christmas, or Orthodox Christmas, was celebrated on the first Saturday after Epiphany, usually January 5th, 6th, or 7th. Some European cultures held on to Old Christmas, particularly in the Scandinavian countries. On the North Carolina Outer Banks, in Hatteras Island, there's a small town called Verdanthe. And in the early 1750s, when the global community had basically adopted the Gregorian calendar, folks in Verdanthe basically said, no thank you. They kept their traditions of celebrating Christmas 11 days after everybody else did. They celebrated with food and drink and games and superstition. And instead of Santa Claus, they have a mythical bull named Old Buck. We'll cover more about Old Buck in the future, but the exciting thing about Old Christmas in Verdanthe is that it's still a thing. You can visit Verdanthe on January 6th at the community center and eat steamed oysters, play games, and join in the festivities. It's an old tradition indeed, but one that's endured through the centuries, from a time before Santa and Christmas trees and caroling. It's important to understand when celebrating with your loved ones this holiday season that this wonderful day we celebrate is entirely dependent on historical context, and it also represents a passing down of not only traditions, but interpreted and reinterpreted meanings from generation to generation, with strong influences from unusual places. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide what Christmas means to you and yours. To learn more about these stories, check out North Carolina Legends by Richard Walser, Stories Behind the Great Traditions of Christmas by Ace Collins, islandfreepress.org, and outerbanksblue.com. This episode was researched, written, produced, and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. You can find everything about our production company at wreakhavocproductions.com. You can find the Carolina Haints Podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Please leave us a review and share it with a friend. This show is also brought to you by Carolina Haints Incorporated, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting folklore storytelling throughout the Carolinas. You can help us on our mission by joining our team on Patreon. With monthly contributions of $5, $10, or $25, you can receive perks such as the Carolina Haints Map of Monsters and Legends, a behind-the-scenes video series, and monthly mini-episodes that are exclusive for members. Just visit patreon.com/Carolina Haints to learn more. You can find everything about us, including the Carolina Haints book and upcoming appearances, at our website, carolinahaints.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Carolina Haints. And as always, feel free to reach out to me directly at carolinahaints@gmail.com. We hope you have a very Merry Christmas and a happy and prosperous New Year. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about those things that go bump in the night.
Boom.